9 words in a restaurant reservation field brought down a 16-year marriage. Not the affair, not the attorneys, not the 4 years of documented infidelity that Meredith Sheridan had assembled with the methodical precision of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this courtroom for a very long time. 9 words. Seat C, Holt beside P. Sheridan, written in Meredith's own handwriting. 3 weeks before the two people named in that sentence had ever been in the same room together. By the time the judge read those words in a Cincinnati divorce court on the morning of the 3rd day of proceedings, 3 things had already happened that nobody in that room had expected. A man had stood in a witness box and admitted to 4 years of choices he would spend the rest of his life accounting for. He had not minimized a single one. When he had told the complete truth, and it had not been enough. A woman had walked into that courtroom carrying nothing. No folder, no briefcase, no documents, no visible preparation of any kind. Just herself and what she knew. And what she knew was about to make everything that had come before it means something different than it had seemed to mean. And a 14-year-old boy named Owen had left his father a voicemail 2 nights before the final day of proceedings. He had asked one question. He had said one more thing after it, and neither of his parents had fully answered him yet. This is how all 3 of those things happened. This is how a marriage that looked one way from the outside looked entirely different from inside a courtroom where the documentation told only part of the story. And this is why when the gavel came down on the 3rd day, nobody in that courtroom had entirely clean hands, including the person who walked in with the most documentation. Let me take you back to the beginning, real quick before we go back. If you are already asking yourself why a woman who spent 4 years building a case against her cheating husband looked afraid the moment that courtroom door opened, you are exactly where this story needs you to be. Subscribe to Thread of Tales right now so you never miss a story like this. Like and share it today, drop a comment, and tell us where you are watching from. We love seeing your comments, and it shows us how far our stories travel. Now back to the beginning. Paul Sheridan was 47 years old, and he designed buildings. Not the largest ones, not the celebrated ones. The kind of buildings that people worked in every day without noticing, which was, in Paul's professional philosophy, exactly the point. A well-designed building did not demand attention. It made the space around it better without asking anyone to acknowledge it. It held its place in the world with quiet confidence and asked for nothing in return. He had been trying to live his private life with that same quality. He had not succeeded. He drove to the courthouse on the first morning in a gray sedan with a coffee stain on the passenger seat from 2 years ago that he had never cleaned. He parked in the garage and sat for a moment before going in. He looked at his left hand on the steering wheel. He was still wearing his wedding ring. He had not intended to wear it. The morning he filed, he had taken it off and set it on the bathroom counter and looked at it for a long time and then put it back on. That had been 4 months ago. The ring was still on his hand. He had stopped asking himself why. He walked into the courthouse. His attorney, Stephen Arlo, had told him one thing above everything else before the first morning of proceedings. Tell the truth on the stand. Do not perform remorse. Do not manage the room. Just tell the truth. Paul had said, "That is the only thing I know how to do anymore." He had no idea walking into that courthouse on day 1 that the person who would ultimately change the outcome of his case was someone he had already met. Someone who had been going back through a timeline for 2 years. Someone who had found 9 words he did not know existed. He walked through the courthouse doors. He was thinking about Owen's voicemail. He had been thinking about it since the night he first heard it. He did not know yet what was in the folder on the other side of the courtroom. He would sit across from it for 2 full days before understanding what it actually was. But what the folder contained was only the second most important thing about it. The most important thing was why it existed at all. Meredith Sheridan arrived at the courthouse 17 minutes before proceedings began. She was 44 years old. She a corporate attorney. 16 years in rooms where preparation was the only currency that mattered, and she had never once arrived in a room underprepared. She set her folder on the respondent's table and opened it briefly and closed it and folded her hands on top of it. The folder was 4 years of work, text messages printed and organized chronologically, hotel receipts cross-referenced against the text message timeline, photographs taken by a private investigator she had hired 22 months into the affair, credit card statements, a personal timeline mapping the affair against the financial records of their marriage. Everything dated, everything indexed, everything cross-referenced with the precision of a woman who understood that courts decide on documentation, not on truth alone. The audience would look at this folder and see a wronged woman who had prepared herself for the worst. They would admire it. They would understand it as survival. They would not yet ask the question that the folder actually answered. Why would a woman who discovered her husband's affair stay silent for 4 years? And why would she hire a private investigator 22 months in rather than immediately? And why was the documentation so thorough that it read less like a record of suffering and more like a project that had been managed toward a specific conclusion? Those questions had an answer. The answer was in a restaurant reservation from 6 years ago. Nobody in that courtroom knew about the reservation yet. Meredith's attorney, Gerald Crane, opened on day one with the precision of a man presenting an airtight case. He described the 16-year marriage, the child, the estate, the 4 years of documented infidelity. He said all of it without drama because the documentation made drama unnecessary. He called Meredith to the stand. She walked to the witness box with the composure of someone who has answered every question she is about to be asked in her own mind at least 100 times. She sat. She folded her hands. She looked at Gerald. She described discovering the affair, quietly, without theatrics. She said she had found a message on Paul's phone 18 months into what she would later understand was a 4-year relationship. She said she had read it once. She had set the phone down. She had gone to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long time. She said she had stayed for Owen, that she had believed the marriage could still be repaired, that she had given 2 more years to that belief before accepting it could not be. The audience believed her. They were supposed to. Then Stephen cross-examined. He was careful and specific. He asked Meredith when she first suspected the affair. 5 years ago, she said. He asked why she waited to act. For Owen, she said. For the hope of repair. He asked whether she had ever met Claire Holt socially before the affair began. Meredith said yes. They had met at a dinner. Stephen asked whose dinner it was. Meredith said it was a social gathering. She did not remember the specific details. Stephen asked whether she had arranged the dinner. Meredith said she did not remember doing so specifically. Stephen asked whether she had a reservation confirmation for that dinner anywhere in her records. Meredith said she did not know where that would be. Stephen paused. He wrote something on his notepad. He said, "No further questions." He sat down. The questions had been too specific to be random. The answers had been too careful to be innocent. But there was nothing to hold, just the quality of a pause that meant something was coming and refused to say what. That evening, somewhere across the city, a woman named Claire was looking at a document she had found 2 years ago in her email archive. She had already decided what she was going to do with it. She had decided the moment she found it. It had taken 2 years to understand exactly what it meant. She put the document in a thin folder. She put the folder in her bag. Gerald closed day one with a sentence that landed in the room like a verdict before the verdict. He said the petitioner had 4 years to end this affair. He chose not to. The respondent had 4 years of her life taken from her. She did not choose that. This court should reflect that difference in its ruling. The judge made a note. She looked at both tables. She said, "We will hear the petitioner's case tomorrow." She adjourned. Paul walked into the courthouse corridor and took out his phone. Owen's voicemail had arrived that afternoon while he was in the courtroom. He pressed play. Owen's voice came through the speaker. 14 years old, carefully flat. He said, "Dad, I know you and Mom both have your reasons. I am not asking you to explain. I just want to know one thing. Is either of you thinking about me in there?" He paused. He said, "Because I am not angry. I just want to know that I exist in that room somewhere. That is all." The voicemail ended. Paul stood in the corridor while people moved around him. He did not move. He did not call Owen back that night. He did not have the words yet. He would find them. But first, on the morning of day 3, the courtroom doors were going to open on something that 6 years of careful decisions had not accounted for. One document, thin folder, one woman who had decided. Paul took the stand on the morning of day 2. He did not button his jacket. He sat. He looked at the judge. Stephen asked him to describe the marriage from his perspective. Paul said, "I am going to tell you something that is not an excuse. It is context. The affair was my choice. I made it every day for 4 years, and I own that without qualification. But the marriage had been cold for a long time before the affair began, and I did not know how to name that out loud to anyone, including Meredith." He described a home that was organized and cold, a wife who was always prepared and never quite present, conversations that stopped reaching each other, the specific loneliness of sharing a space with someone who was running something he could not see. He said, "I am not saying Meredith was a bad wife. I am saying our marriage had become a performance that both of us were maintaining and that neither of us had the courage to stop. The difference is that my performance included someone else. The audience did not know what to do with that sentence." Gerald cross-examined. He established the affair with surgical precision. Paul confirmed everything, every detail. He did not minimize a single one. Gerald asked, "Did you love your wife?" Paul was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I loved who I believed she was. I am no longer certain I understood who she actually was, and I think she could say the same about me." Gerald did not follow it. He produced a document instead. He said, "Your Honor, I have one further piece of evidence, a text message sent from Mr. Sheridan's phone 8 months ago." He read it. "I cannot do this anymore." Gerald said the message had been sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. He said it represented Paul's own words about his domestic life. He said it was consistent with a man who had emotionally abandoned his family long before the legal proceedings began. Stephen objected. The message required context. The full exchange was necessary for it to mean anything. Gerald said he had only the single message. The judge said, "The message is admitted with the disputed context noted for the record." Paul looked at the text on the screen. He remembered exactly what it referred to. A student at his school who had come to him in crisis that November. A boy he had spent 3 weeks helping navigate a situation that had nearly ended very badly. He had sent that text to a college friend at midnight after the student had finally gotten the help he needed. Or it had meant, "I cannot keep carrying the weight of other people's pain without setting some of it down somewhere." It had had nothing to do with his marriage, nothing to do with Owen, nothing to do with anything in that courtroom. He could not prove that. He looked at the judge. Her expression had shifted toward a conclusion. He had told the truth on that stand. All of it. And it had not been enough. He looked at his attorney. Stephen was already writing. What Paul did not know was that the truth he had told on that stand was only part of the story. The other part was in a thin folder in a woman's bag, and she was already on her way. That evening, Stephen called Paul. He said, "The motion to call Claire Holt as a witness has been granted." Paul said, "What does she want to say?" Stephen said, "She wants to tell the truth about how you two met." Paul was quiet. He thought about a dinner 6 years ago, out of a restaurant in the warehouse district, a gathering that had felt like coincidence, an introduction that had felt natural. He thought about Meredith at that dinner, warm, attentive, watching. He thought about the specific quality of her attention that evening. He had called it contentment at the time. He was no longer sure that was the right word. Gerald made his final summary of day 2 at 4 in the afternoon. He was thorough and devastating, and he ended with a sentence designed to close every remaining door. He said, 3 days of testimony, 3 days of documentation, 3 days of a man sitting across from the woman he wronged and offering context where there is no context. This court has everything it needs. The judge looked at her notes. She looked at the folder on Meredith's table. She looked at Paul. Her expression had the quality of someone who has reached a conclusion and is organizing the language to express it. Gerald sat. He leaned toward Meredith and said something low. Meredith nodded once. She looked like a woman who had spent 4 years building a case and was watching it arrive exactly where she had always intended it to go. The judge looked at Stephen. She opened her mouth to speak. Stephen stood. Your Honor, before final arguments, should the petitioner request permission to call one additional witness? Meredith looked up from the folder. It was the first time in 2 days she had looked up from the folder. Before that door opens, before Claire walks in with nothing and says the sentence that makes the last 20 minutes look completely different than they did when you were watching them. Subscribe to Thread of Tales right now. hit the bell. Like this video. Share it with someone today. Back to Paul. And the night before day 3, Paul sat in his temporary apartment. Somebody else's furniture. Somebody else's taste. He had been living there for 4 months and had not put a single thing on the walls because making it his space would mean acknowledging that the other space was no longer his. He listened to Owen's voicemail for the 4th time. Owen's voice came through the speaker. 14 years old. Carefully flat. The specific flatness of a teenager who has rehearsed something until the emotion is even and the words are clear. He said, "Dad, I know you and Mom both have your reasons for everything that is happening. I am not going to pretend I understand all of it. I know I am not supposed to understand all of it yet." He paused. He said, "But I have been thinking about what happens in that courtroom every day. I think about it when I wake up and when I am at school and when I am trying to sleep. Unaware, and I keep coming back to one thing." Another pause, longer than the first. He said, "Is either of you thinking about me in there?" Paul stopped breathing. Then Owen said one more thing, the sentence Paul had not expected, the one that had been living inside him since the first time he heard it. Owen said, "Because I am not angry. I just want to know that I exist in that room somewhere. That is all." The voicemail ended. Paul sat in the chair that was not his and turned that sentence over in his mind. "I am not angry. I just want to know that I exist in that room somewhere." He thought about a 14-year-old boy sitting on the edge of his bed deciding to say that instead of what he could have said instead. Deciding that what he needed was not to be heard, but to be seen. That the difference between those two things was everything. He did not call Owen back that night. He did not yet have words that were adequate. He had decided that finding them was the only thing that mattered after that courtroom closed for the last time. He would find them. But first the door was going to open. And 9 words were about to make everything that came before them mean something different. Gerald Crane's final summary on the morning of day 3 was the best piece of courtroom advocacy Paul had ever witnessed from the other side. Precise, structured, each point placed to close the door on the one before it. He described 4 years of documented infidelity, the financial implications, the impact on a marriage and a child. He described Meredith as a woman who had endured in silence for the sake of her family and who deserved the full protection of the law. He ended with one sentence. He said, "The petitioner cheated for 4 years and is now asking this court to reward him for admitting it. This court should not." The room was still. The judge looked at her notes. She looked at Meredith's folder. She looked at Paul. She reached for her pen. She held it for a moment. She set it down. She looked at Stephen. Stephen stood. "Your Honor, before final arguments. The petitioner requests permission to call one additional witness." Gerald was immediately on his feet. "Your Honor, this witness was not disclosed in pretrial filings. 48 hours notice is not sufficient preparation. Well, this is a deliberate tactical ambush at the moment of conclusion designed to..." The judge held up one hand. Gerald stopped. She looked at Stephen. "Make your case," she said. Stephen said, "The witness has direct personal knowledge of the circumstances under which the relationship at the center of this case was initiated. That knowledge is directly relevant to the financial claims before this court. However, if the foundation of the respondent's case was constructed rather than discovered, the court's assessment of relative conduct changes significantly." The judge looked at Gerald. Gerald said, "Your Honor, this is..." "Sit down, Mr. Crane." Gerald sat. The judge was quiet for a long moment. She looked at both tables. She said, "The motion is granted. The witness has direct relevant knowledge, and this court will hear it. You will have full opportunity to cross-examine Mr. Crane." She looked toward the back of the courtroom. She said, "Call your witness, Mr. Arlo." Stephen said, "The petitioner calls Claire Holt." The doors opened. Claire Holt walked in, wearing flat shoes and carrying a thin folder with one document inside. Claire walked down the center aisle without hurrying. She did not look at Paul. She did not look at Meredith. She pushed through the gate and walked to the witness stand and sat down and was sworn in and looked at the judge. Stephen approached. He asked her to confirm her name and profession. She said, "Claire Holt, landscape architect. I have my own firm, 14 years of practice." He asked her to describe her relationship to the parties. She said, "I know Paul Sheridan. We were in a relationship for 4 years that ended 2 years ago. I met Meredith Sheridan for the first time at a dinner approximately 6 years ago. Stephen said, "Before I ask you about that dinner, I want to ask you one question directly. Why are you here today? You were not compelled. You came forward voluntarily. Why?" Claire looked at him. She said, "Because I was used as an instrument in something I did not consent to and did not understand at the time. And because when I understood it, I realized the version of events being presented to this court was missing something the court needs to know in order to decide fairly. I am not here for Paul. I am not here against Meredith. I am here because the truth is the truth, and I am not willing to let an incomplete version of it be the version that stands when I have the complete one." Stephen said, "Tell us about the dinner." Claire described it with the precision of someone who has been over the same ground many times and knows every detail of it. It had been at a restaurant in the warehouse district, a private dining room, 8 people, which she had been invited by a woman she knew professionally, a contact from an industry event 6 months prior. The contact had described it as a casual gathering of people in adjacent creative fields. She had arrived and been seated beside Paul Sheridan. She described Meredith at that dinner, warm, attentive, the specific quality of a hostess ensuring everyone felt comfortable and seen. She had thought Meredith was gracious. She had thought the seating was casual. So Stephen asked her when she began to question that assumption. Claire said, 2 years after the affair ended. "I was searching my email archive for a project file. I found the original invitation to the dinner. The woman who had invited me had forwarded me an email from Meredith Sheridan asking her to invite me specifically. The email described me by name. It described my firm. It said Meredith thought I would be a good addition to the gathering." She paused. She said, "I had never met Meredith before that dinner. We had no professional overlap. There was no organic reason for her to know my name or my firm." Stephen asked, "What did you do when you found that email?" Claire said, "I started going back through the timeline. I reached out to 2 other people who had been at that dinner. One had also been specifically requested by Meredith. One told me that Meredith had called her the week before the dinner and mentioned she was hoping Paul would have a good evening, that she felt he had been working too hard and needed to meet interesting people." The courtroom was very quiet. Gerald set down his pen. Claire continued. She described the months that followed, the professional connections that had felt natural, the proximity established before the affair began. She described with careful precision the specific moments in which the conditions had been arranged. Then she said, "There is one more thing." Stephen looked up from his notepad. She said, 6 months into the affair, Meredith called me. She said she was calling as a friend. She said Paul seemed happier lately and she was glad. She asked questions about how I was doing, what I was working on, whether I found the balance between professional and personal life sustainable. She paused. So she said, near the end of that call, she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "I just want him to be with someone who appreciates him the way he deserves. I hope you know how good he is." The room was completely still. Claire looked at the judge. She said, "At the time, I heard that as the generous sentiment of a woman who had accepted that her marriage was ending. I understand it differently now. She was not telling me she had accepted the situation. She was confirming that the arrangement was functioning as intended." Gerald objected. "Speculation," the judge said, sustained as to characterization. "Ms. Holt, please describe what was said rather than your interpretation." Claire nodded. She described the exact words, the exact questions, the exact tone. Then Stephen produced the document from the thin folder. He handed it to Claire. He asked her to identify it. Why, she said, "It is the reservation confirmation for the dinner, where I first met Paul and Meredith Sheridan. It is in Meredith's name. It is dated 3 weeks before the dinner." He asked her to read the notes field of the reservation. Claire looked at it. She read it aloud. "Seat C, Holt beside P. Sheridan." 9 words. Written 3 weeks before Claire and Paul had ever been in the same room. The courtroom did not react immediately. It took a moment for those 9 words to fully arrive. Not a theory, not an interpretation, not a pattern assembled after the fact. A plan, written down, dated, in Meredith Sheridan's own handwriting, 3 weeks before the people named in it had ever met. Stephen entered the document into evidence. He sat down. The judge picked up the reservation confirmation. She read it. She read it again. She set it down. She looked at Meredith. Meredith was looking at the table. Her hands were folded on the folder. One finger was moving, just one. The index finger of her right hand. A small, repetitive motion against the folder's surface. Barely visible. The kind of movement that happens when the body is managing something the mind has decided not to show. Paul saw it. He had been married to Meredith for 16 years. He had seen her hand on 100 surfaces in 100 rooms. It had never moved like that. He watched the finger. He thought about a dinner reservation written 3 weeks before two people met. He thought about 16 years. He thought about what it would mean if the coldness he had described from the stand had not been a distance that grew naturally between two people over time. If it had been a design, a climate being managed toward a specific outcome from a specific moment. He thought about a phone call Claire had described. I just want him to be with someone who appreciates him the way he deserves. He thought about Meredith saying those words 6 months into a relationship she had engineered. He thought about what a person has to believe about their marriage and their spouse to say those words. He sat with all of it. The finger stopped moving. Meredith folded her hands. She looked at the table. She did not look up again. Gerald cross-examined for 20 minutes. He challenged every point. He made every available argument with the skill of a prepared attorney. Claire answered every question with the same calm. When he was finished, the judge looked at the reservation confirmation on her bench. She looked at 9 words. Judge Park set the confirmation down and looked at both parties. She spoke carefully and without performance. She said, "This court has heard testimony over 3 days that has established the following. Mr. Sheridan engaged in a 4-year intimate relationship with another woman during the course of his marriage. He has not disputed this. The documentation is thorough and credible." She paused. She said, "This court has also heard testimony from Ms. Claire Holt, corroborated by a reservation confirmation entered into evidence that establishes with reasonable certainty that the initial introduction between Mr. Sheridan and Ms. Holt was deliberately arranged by Mrs. Sheridan. Specifically, the reservation confirmation shows that Mrs. Sheridan requested specific seating placing. Mrs. Holt beside Mr. Sheridan 3 weeks before the two had ever met. The room was very still. She continued. She said, "This court is not in a position to determine with certainty the full extent of Mrs. Sheridan's intentions over the 6-year period in question. What this court can determine is that the narrative Mrs. Sheridan presented of a wronged spouse who discovered an affair and endured it for the sake of her family is materially incomplete in ways that are directly relevant to the financial claims before this court. A spouse who deliberately arranges the conditions for an affair and then documents that affair as leverage is not presenting clean hands to this court. The law requires clean hands." She made a note. She said, "The marital estate will be divided 55 to 45 in Mr. Sheridan's favor, reflecting the court's assessment of the relative conduct of both parties. Spousal support is denied given the totality of the circumstances. Each party will bear their own attorney fees." She looked at both of them. She said, "This court also notes that the minor child, Owen Sheridan, age 14, is the person most affected by these proceedings and the person least visible within them. Both parties are ordered to attend co-parenting mediation within 30 days. This is not optional." She set down her pen. She said, "I have been on this bench for 14 years. I do not assign the word villain in divorce proceedings because the word almost never captures what actually happened in a marriage. What I will say is this. No ruling I can issue today resolves what actually happened in this marriage. It resolves only what this court has the jurisdiction to resolve. Everything else belongs to the two of you. I would encourage you to take that seriously. Your son is watching. He will be watching for the rest of his life." She banged the gavel once. Court adjourned. Paul sat in his car in the courthouse parking garage. He was not thinking about the ruling. He was thinking about Owen's voicemail. About, "I am not angry. I just want to know that I exist in that room somewhere." He took out his phone. He called Owen. Owen answered on the second ring. Paul said, "I owe you an answer to the question you asked." Owen was quiet. Paul said, "Yes. I was thinking about you the whole time. Every minute of every day in that room. I did not know how to show it from inside those walls. I do not have a good explanation for that. I just know that you were there. You were always there." A long pause. Owen said, "Okay, Dad, that is a start." Paul held the phone after the call ended. He looked at his left hand on the steering wheel. The ring. He had worn it through 4 months of divorce proceedings, through a 4-year affair, through 16 years of a marriage that had been, in ways he was only now beginning to fully understand, something other than what he had believed it was. He took it off. He held it in his palm, small and plain and gold, the weight of 16 years and the weight of almost nothing. He placed it in the cup holder. He thought about tomorrow, about calling Owen again, and the day after, about the specific ordinary work of making someone feel they exist to you, not in a courtroom, but in the texture of every ordinary day. That was the work. He started the car. Meredith stood in the courthouse corridor alone for the first time in 4 days. Gerald had spoken to her briefly. Professional, careful, grounds for appeal. Meet next week to discuss options. He was sorry for the outcome. She had nodded. She would call. He left. She stood in the corridor holding the folder. 4 years of documentation, text messages and hotel receipts and photographs, and a timeline she had built herself. Everything assembled with the methodical precision that organized every part of her professional life. She looked at the folder. She thought about a restaurant in the warehouse district 6 years ago, a private dining room, a reservation she had made 3 weeks before the gathering, a notes field where she had typed 9 words and hit confirm and moved on to the next thing. She thought about what she had told herself at the time. She had told herself she was testing him, giving the marriage the information it needed to resolve itself one way or the other. That if he failed the test, she would know something true about him, and she would use that truth to protect herself. She had told herself many things. She stood in the corridor with the folder in her hands, and she understood. With the clarity that comes when a strategy has fully played out and revealed its actual cost, that what she had lost was not the case. She had lost something she could not have named while she was building the folder. Something that had existed before the reservation. Something the reservation had ended the moment she wrote it. She put the folder in a recycling bin near the elevator. She walked toward the exit without looking back. Claire sat in her car outside the courthouse. She had not brought a coat, and it was cold. She had known it would be cold. She had not brought one anyway because she had not let herself think about after until after was actually here. A journalist knocked on her window. She shook her head. He moved on. She sat in the car. She thought about a dinner 6 years ago that she had believed was coincidence. About 4 years of choices made inside that belief. About a phone call that had felt like friendship and had been inventory. About 9 words in a reservation field written 3 weeks before she walked into a room and met a man she would spend 4 years with. Seat C, Holt beside P. Sheridan. She had been a seating arrangement. She thought about whether she was angry. She looked at what she was actually feeling the way she looked at any landscape she was asked to work with. For what was genuinely there rather than what she had expected to find. She was not angry. She was clear. She had gone into that courtroom with the truth, and she had said it. Not for Paul, not against Meredith, because the truth was the only thing she had that was entirely hers. Nobody had arranged it. Nobody had positioned it. It had grown in her over 2 years of going back through a timeline she had originally misunderstood, and it belonged to her completely. She started the car. She had a site visit that afternoon, a garden she had been designing for 3 months. She was going to drive there and stand in it and look at what had grown since her last visit and decide what it needed next. She pulled out of the parking lot. She did not look back either. Outrow CTA, 5130 to 5330. Here is what I want you to hold from this story. We told you at the beginning that 9 words in a restaurant reservation field brought down a 16-year marriage. Now you understand why. Seat C, Holt beside P. Sheridan. Not the affair, not the 4 years. Not the documentation. Those 9 words, written 3 weeks before 2 people met. In the handwriting of a woman who walked into a courtroom as the wronged wife and walked out as the architect. Paul Sheridan cheated for 4 years. That is true and complete, and the ring in the cup holder of a gray sedan is not absolution. It is the beginning of a different kind of honesty, That is all it is, and it is also everything it needs to be. Meredith Sheridan walked into that courtroom with everything. The documentation, the composure, the 4 years of careful preparation, and a reservation confirmation she had forgotten she had written. The most important piece of evidence in the entire case was not in her folder. It was in a restaurant's booking system from 6 years ago, and Claire Holt walked in with nothing. Just the truth about a dinner that was not accidental, and a relationship that was not coincidental, and the specific, quiet courage of a person who chose honesty when silence was considerably easier and would have cost her nothing. Owen Sheridan is 14 years old. He said, "I am not angry. I just want to know that I exist in that room somewhere." His father called him from a parking garage. He said, "You exist. You were always there." Owen said, "Okay, Dad." That is a start. It is a start. Don't forget to click on the subscribe button so you never miss a story like this. Like this video. Share it with someone today. We will see you in the next story.